The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame. Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games, games that respect your time. I'm Reagan Kelly, and I'm joined once again by my very awesome co-hosts,
Laura Nash
and Shane Kelly.
And this week we are talking about the highly influential and incredibly chronologically diffuse game, Kentucky Route Zero.
Yeah, so Kentucky Route Zero is probably the most influential and most important short game that we haven't covered. Because we are cowards and we thought, what if it never ends? Like, what if it's an episodic game? And we kept saying, oh, we'll cover it when the 5th episode comes out. And we've done that for 4 years.
It was literally on the list of games that I thought we should probably cover that I constructed before the beginning of the show. So that would have been in 2014. This game, its episodes 1 and 2, our acts 1 and 2, came out in 2013.
Which is all we're covering today, by the way.
Right.
So we could have done this in 2013.
We could have easily done everything we're going to do today years ago.
So to put this into context a little bit, at the start of the calendar year, we've just done our games of the year, and we feel like, we've got plenty of time to cover 2020 games. Let's go back and cover this stuff that we swore we'd do years ago. Thus, inevitably leading to the same situation we had this December of rushing to try and cover everything that came out in 2019.
Except this is actually relevant now because the last chapter is getting released on January 28th.
Yes.
We are actually relevant covering it after many
In fact,
years of
we're
delay.
covering it early. We're ahead of the game, wouldn't you say? Because we're recording this 1 week before the release of Kentucky Route Zero Act 5, the final act, and also the TV edition, which means that you'll soon be able to play this game on your consoles like Xbox One, PS4, and even Nintendo Switch.
What kind of Texan are you saying route instead of route?
It's a good point. I should probably say route, shouldn't I? But you know what? I've always just thought route. I don't know. It's what I've always heard Kentucky Route Zero in my head. Is that wrong?
Nah, I'm on route.
Accent? I mean, it's accents. I'm just surprised because I've never heard anyone from our hometown ever say anything but route.
That's interesting. I don't know. My brain is broken.
No, your brain is fine. I'm just
folks, I've lived all over. I grew up in Texas. I've moved to New York, the Midwest. I've lived in Denver, and I've lived on the West Coast. I've been around, and I don't know where that particular phraseology crept into my head, but there it is.
It's fine either way, I'm sure.
So yeah, I think it is probably a good time for us to be covering this, obviously, with the upcoming final act coming out. But I did kind of want to talk a little bit maybe more about like where this game came from and a little bit more about why we haven't covered it up to now, which I'm not making excuses exactly, but it just sort of, I found it a little bit interesting looking back over the years of Kentucky Route Zero in games, right? So this game had a Kickstarter that at the time seemed like a successful Kickstarter and now seems completely ridiculously small and cute. This game, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it raised something under $9,000 on Kickstarter when it initially did its Kickstarter back in, I think, 2012. And based on the wild success of that, they decided to apply themselves to developing this game over the course of the entire ensuing decade. And so they put out 2 acts in the first year. And then there was some, I think the third act came out in 2014, and then there have been sort of progressively longer times. When did the 4th act come out? I should have that in front of me. I have a Wikipedia.
Some time ago.
Yes, Act 4 came out in 2016. July of 2016, so a couple years gap there. And then it's been a long damn time since July 19th of 2016, but here we are. I think the reason that I didn't play this before, even though this is one of those games that got constantly recommended to the show and recommended online to people who like indie games and other, short games is that Laura mentioned that we kind of were kind of waiting for all the pieces to come out. Looking at this game, I thought like this is clearly it wears on its sleeve that it's a surreal or magical realist thing. And something about that made me think this is something that I'm going to need to immerse myself in. And I was worried that if I played just a small chunk of it, that I either wouldn't feel like I got a complete picture or that I was like lost or something. I think all of that was needless. Looking back on it, I really probably would have enjoyed this quite a lot back in 2013, and I don't feel like I would have probably been waiting in dire suspense for the years and years since. I think this just would have been a nice thing to go back to every few years when they came out with more of it. So, that's on
So
me.
don't be like us.
Well, now you don't have to.
If you ever have the opportunity to go back in time, don't be
right.
like us.
Right. But I mean, there we are. But I mean, like, if for some reason you missed Kentucky Route Zero and all of the explanations of it, the description that they provide, I think, is a pretty solid one. Kentucky Route Zero is a magical realist adventure game. And by adventure game, we're talking about more or less the traditional point and click style. Magical realist adventure game about a secret highway running through the caves beneath Kentucky and the mysterious folks who travel it. So a couple things to unpack there, but the main one, I guess, would be magical realist. And I find it a bit difficult to explain that, but I'm going to turn this over to Laura, who has made a bit of a study of explaining what the heck magical realism is to people.
Yes, I co-founded a theater festival about magical realism. Another reason why we never covered it is because I kept wanting to do this with my artistic director, and she was busy putting on a theater festival. So really hard to get her in the studio for that, in our fictional studio that doesn't exist.
Yes, the studio of the airwaves.
Would you describe our studio as magical realist?
No, and this is why. So, yeah, magic realism, most people know it from books like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's like this Latino tradition. But basically, I had to build a Twine game because I was getting so many bad submissions that were inappropriate that was called, "Is your play magical realism?" And you answered questions, and it would route you to, "No, please do not submit. Maybe take another look." Or, "Yes, please send this right away." So basically, magical realism is really close to sci-fi, surrealist, absurdism, science fiction, all this other stuff. But basically, everything is realistic until it's not. And what I mean by that is there's these fantastic events and they happen seamlessly within a realistic environment. So everyone accepts them as part of reality. No one's pointing and going, "Look at that weird thing that just happened. It's so weird that that happened. Why did that happen?" Everyone is like, "Oh man, I'm so upset that my girlfriend turned into an almond." Or like,
I would be too.
Yeah, but no one's like, "Why the hell is she an almond? That's so weird." No one ever says it's weird. So often these kind of weird, fantastical things happen and they show a character's inner emotion or something about the environment or something else. Like they generally don't interpret for you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
I one thing I don't really get is the distinction between surrealism and magical realism,
or absurdism.
So I think about or absurdism, right?
Yeah,
because I think about play like Eugene Ionesco's The Rhinoceros.
Yes,
which it's been a while, but that's a play where a man is struggling against a society gone mad, where everyone is essentially succumbing to peer pressure and turning into rhinoceroses.
Mm-hmm.
Does that meet your definition of magical realism? Because I always heard it brought up as absurdism.
Yes. So at absurdism or surrealism, things are happening for no reason. And also, it is mostly with people dealing with the outcomes of the thing. And magical realism is a lot more emotive. It's a lot about like the environment, like people are lost and then suddenly a doorway opens up, or people are in love and petals rain from the sky. It's kind of like the magic of emotions or the environment manifesting itself, where absurdism or surrealism is often like nothing makes sense. Magical realism is, if I just understood myself more, maybe this would make sense. Does that help?
I think, yeah, and I think it's a great genre for like sort of making things that would be very poetic metaphors reality, right? So
Yeah,
things that might give you some kind of insight into maybe the state of mind of the characters or something about them
yeah.
interior lives that is brought out into the real world, rather than just throwing absurd weirdness in for the sake of
Yeah,
weirdness.
and I'm not a gatekeeper. Like, there's plenty of absurdism or surrealism that shares DNA with magic realism. The main thing is like the whole world isn't weird. A couple of things are off. They might get increasingly off, but really it's kind of about the characters and their journey through it, not necessarily like it's less interested in society and more about people.
Hmm. I like
So
that.
that's kind of the differentiation. So one of the cool things about I don't think there's been any other video games that have played so particularly about it. Like there's plenty of magic realism elements in video games. If you guys are still lost, like what the hell is this? I always pointed to Jane the Virgin or Being John Malkovich as really good pop culture examples.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah.
it's cool to have it as a video game because you get this kind of larger than life thing, but it's still rooted to character. Um, which is why I'm very surprised that I didn't play this until this week,
Yeah.
despite literally like I kept also being like, what if we did this as an event where we put it on a projector? And they were like, have you played the game? Nope. Whoops.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those games that like has a massive reputation. I remember that in 2013, it was on a lot of Game of the Year lists, and I went back and looked, and Rock Paper Shotgun, did this listed this as their Game of the Year for 2013, which is interesting considering it was incomplete and still remains incomplete to this day as of this recording. But it was their Game of the Year for 2013, a site that I don't think tends to do. I mean, I haven't looked over their entire history, but I don't think they are, they don't exclusively cover indie games for sure, and I don't think they tend to always have indie games as their games of the year. And it's won a zillion awards since then. I mean, it would be a little bit hard to even go back and list them all.
Yeah. And guys, it's basically interactive fiction, so
True, yeah. There's a lot of elements in this. The game kind of alternates between a few different sort of gameplay styles. Most of the game takes place in a format that feels a lot like your traditional point and click adventure games, a genre that I think was getting a lot of nostalgic, reinterpretation back in the early parts of the 20 teens. So I think it was very of the early 2013 moment to make a artistic reinterpretation or artistic take on literary take on the point and click adventure game. But it has other things that feel a little bit more forward looking. Like there's the other sort of main mode of play in this game is driving around on a map and encountering scenarios that are presented as text in a way that feels very much like things like Twine games that might come later. Like something about the way that those sort of like encounters on the road play out reminded
80
me a lot
days,
of
yeah.
like 80 days is a great one. It really reminded me of a lot of things that would actually come later. This game had a lot of influence on basically the entire decade worth of artistic narrative work in video games. And it's interesting to see that in retrospect, having not played it. This was always sort of like a big glaring hole in my, like, I don't know, video game knowledge, I guess. And it was sort of interesting to play it and see all these things as like, oh, I definitely see how this feels very prescient for 2013, and I also can think of almost a dozen ways that this particular thing about the game has cropped up in other games that are presumably influenced by it over the years.
Yeah, including a game that's not really focused on you winning.
True, it's very focused on like presenting narrative and interesting scenarios and like kind of bizarre or interesting visuals, and really not interested in puzzles, which I think would have like felt more innovative as a point and click adventure game in 2013. That was, I think, at a time where like you sort of expected a game with this style of interface to be primarily about solving puzzles, but there's no rubber chicken with a pulley in it or anything like that. I don't even think there's I don't think there's even an inventory system
Yeah.
in this game.
I actually kind of think that when you mentioned the rubber chicken with a pulley in it, magical realism and this sort of adventure game genre is in a lot of ways to me a very perfect wedding of genre and like game style. Because in what other genre would you like just willingly accept being asked? What other genre of fiction or of game would you would just willingly accept being asked to file a bunch of paperwork before you're allowed to ask someone for directions?
It's true, yeah. It does have that sort of. I mean, I can't say that I can think of any games before this, adventure games before this, that I would say are specifically magical realism. But you definitely, if you look back over the history of adventure games, there's certainly more hints of magical realism than you'd find in most other styles of games. So I could think of things like Grim Fandango, not exactly magical realist, but a little bit.
Well, again, I don't want to gatekeep, but I think one of the things that feels like, to me, the most magical realism thing about this is like people are complaining about debts and bills to pay, and then 2 seconds later, like the back of a barn opens up. Like
True.
It's the juxtaposition of those things that like you keep going back to the real world. Like this game doesn't let you leave. Like you don't get to go completely into fancy.
Yeah, it's very it stays very grounded in the fact that like this is about an evening in these people's lives, or a night in these people's lives. The main character Conway has a job to do that continues to sort of carry him forward, and it's a very mundane job. He has to make a delivery.
Got to make a delivery,
and yeah, there's sort of bizarre or magical realist elements in everything about this game, but it never goes full fantasy or full, alternate reality. It always sort of feels like they're just at the edges of normal.
Mid-level weirdness permeates the game. It never goes full on high weirdness. I think there's some moments, but like visually and stylistically and also narratively, it's like very grounded in like the kind of icons of Americana that you would expect to see on like a picture postcard picked up from like a roadside gas station. And the visual, the art style, I think, also kind of lends itself back to Sword and Sorcery Super Brothers EP from that was around like 2001. So that predates this by just a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it has this visual style that is also kind of very of its time, but people, I think around that time were looking at like these sorts of games, and we're trying to create this kind of visual style that was both kind of beautiful and like extremely stripped down, and I think that's kind of the it feels like a very lo-fi game, if that makes sense, just across the board narratively too.
Yeah, I think you said 2001 instead of 2011, but I knew what you meant.
Oh yeah, I meant 2011.
You meant 2011. Don't send us an email.
Yeah, don't email us.
That's basically what I was saying.
I have the timeline. Am I wrong on the timeline there?
No, this game, that would have
right.
been a couple of years before this game came out, which makes sense to me in that it could potentially have been an influence, or if not an influence, then at least sort of part of the same moment in video games in a way.
So a couple years ago, I was able to see the video games exhibit at Victoria and Albert, and Kentucky Route Zero was there because of all their influences. And something I thought was really cool was they were talking about like they wanted this kind of flat look because they were inspired by like theater sets and kind of like trying to make it feel like real spaces that people went into, that you could kind of wander around these 3D spaces. And like they could control the camera, so they could control the shadows, and that was something they thought was really cool, because they could like put shadows directly on parts of it or put it away and kind of confuse people and play tricks with the lighting. So they really wanted to take that kind of like simplified look, and then like, what if we tried to make it feel like it could be a real place? Like that was something they really liked playing with, because apparently this started off because they liked Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and they were like, caves are super cool.
Yeah, that
Caves
makes
are
sense.
super cool. Let's do something.
That's really cool. Yeah, I definitely have the sort of feeling from this that it's a game that feels a bit like it was made by theater people or book people. You know what I mean? Like it feels like it's almost more part of that tradition than the traditional video game space.
Yeah, they called it their Katamari ball of art.
You know, it's actually weird that you mentioned that, because wasn't the Colossal Cave adventure also inspired by Mammoth Cave?
Yes, and they were going to remake that. That's where they started this whole damn thing.
Oh, that's great.
Was what if we remade Colossal Cave Adventure, and then like eventually became this thing.
I guess all video game nerd, you're not a real video game nerd unless you've explored the Mammoth Cave.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's such a cool connection.
Shout out to our national parks.
Yeah, for real.
Maybe we should go outside.
Never. I refuse.
I'll live my life underground before I go outside. But while we're on the topic of the imagery of the game, I do want to call one thing out, which is just the typography. The game uses its typography very well. It has a very simple typography style, but it uses one of, I think, the very best monospaced fonts, which is called Inconsolata. It's a terrific font if you ever need to choose one for your terminal window. And they also do some really neat stuff with it. What the most noticeable is like that the word zero, every time it appears in text here, in a very like House of Leaves kind of way, has like shadowy clouds very softly and faintly floating across it. I don't know if I didn't really notice that many other really obvious flourishes to the text, but the way that they like time it and things like that, I thought was very well done.
I just read about the text animations. Apparently they were inspired by Earthbound. But one of the tricks they did is that they have it slow, it animates in, so it feels like you're having more like a real-time thing, but they slow it down at commas and slow it down further at periods, so it feels more like speech, like the text is pausing. And it's those kind of little polishes that like to try to get rhythm. Like it feels like a really polished experience, and I think that's something that is why this is so beloved, is like you'd make a little thing but you craft it really well, is kind of like you feel like you're in good hands in this game. Like you're doing weird things are happening but you feel safe. You don't feel like this game is going to crash.
Yeah, and something about that like that was a bit of a surprise to me. Like I'm sort of on record on the show of like not being really that into point and click adventure games. Part of that is not liking the flow of a narrative to be interrupted by puzzles, particularly bad puzzles, which seem to be epidemic in point and click adventure games. This game has a flow to it that feels so much more natural than any other point and click adventure game I think I've ever played. A big part of that is the fact that it is mostly using the interface of a point and click adventure game to deliver narrative, but narrative always comes first with it. It's always about continuing your story, and there's very little time in this game where you feel like you're stuck or moving too slowly or what have you. The story moves at a pace, and the text is a part of that too. Like just the act of reading text in this game, which is a lot of what you'll be doing. It's not an overwhelming amount of text in this game. It feels a little bit like a terse American prose style, right? But it has a pace to it that I wasn't expecting, and it was like a huge surprise. I think I would have probably played this game sooner if I had realized in advance how effortless it would feel to play, and what a kind of cool experience it was. There was like zero moments of frustration for me in it, which was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I think
Before we
I was.
totally leave the topic of little things that are polished in the game,
Mhm.
and especially around that point and click adventure interface, um, something that I don't think I've seen in a point and click adventure game before, but was almost hard to notice, but very nicely polished. Um, uh, First off, the design of the cursor was kind of cute. It was a very minimal hand. And I've never seen it quite look like that. But the thing that was odd about it and unique was the movement of the cursor. As the screen would scroll, as you, like, for example, were walking or driving, the point, you wouldn't be moving your mouse, but the cursor would stay in a fixed position in the world.
That was odd and
Which,
interesting.
yeah, it was kind of a little unusual, but it did kind of make the feeling of navigating the space a little bit different.
I liked that it also allowed you to kind of like click and hold on a place to continue moving in a particular
Yeah.
direction without having to like reposition.
hmm And also the very odd little indicator for when you've clicked on a place. Usually when you click to walk
Oh,
somewhere
that's a
in
really good one.
video game, there's some indication. And here it was something I've certainly never seen before, which was a little ghostly peg appears in the ground and a horseshoe rings around it, which
Mhm.
definitely cute, and it's very clear. And I don't know, it was kind of an odd choice, but it works.
It's a little piece of Americana that, yes,
Yeah.
still somehow feels a little off because of its sort of like ghostly color.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that about it a lot. That's a good one to call out, because I'd almost forgotten to mention it. And it's that's really cool, and you see it a lot. And that animation, like, ooh, that's a good animation.
Yeah, the first couple times I was like, "Wait, am I driving a stake into the ground?" And it's like, "Oh no, it's a horseshoe." So we've talked a lot about the polish of the game, and a huge part of that to me is the writing, which we haven't necessarily called out specifically. I think you talked about things that surprised you. I was a little bit. I was pretty sure I would like the writing because so many people I like have praised the writing of this game, but I thought it might be that really stark literary writing that I find really boring, or like really florid, overdone stuff. And I think it's that really, they've struck a beautiful balance to me. Apparently, again, from that essay from that V&A book, they said that they were inspired by not Samuel Beckett's plays, but his stage directions, where he has things like the door is imperceptibly ajar, like these little
I
extra
love that.
bits.
That's really true. If you haven't read a Samuel Beckett play, they're worth reading, even if you've seen them, because they are written in a really interesting way for a play. They're yeah. That's a
Yeah.
really cool thing to note as a influence.
Yeah, so like a completely non-spoilery description they have in the game is an abandoned spider web stretches across the bottom of a saucepan. A skillet is seasoned with dust.
That's some good text.
That's some good text. So my fear wasn't merited. That this would be kind of, I mean, we're throwing around all these illusions and all these kind of like highfalutin bits. I thought it wouldn't be fun to read. Turns
It
out
is
the people who said this was good were right.
it is fun, and it's occasionally also very funny, in a not in a way that doesn't feel like it's trying to make jokes. It feels like the way that absurd or strange things can sometimes be funny, even when even when they're sad, or even when they're not trying to go out of their way to be funny. I took a few screenshots of moments in the game that I thought were like bits of good writing, and I mean I could share a couple of them. Hopefully they won't be too spoilery. Um, there's a conversation you have in the first act with someone who, so you've just set up a television for them, and you turn it on, and a picture of a barn appears on the screen, and she says to you, "That's not how it's supposed to look. You've made a mistake setting it up. Is it a foreign object to you? Which of your parents was it who wouldn't allow you to watch television?" And then your choices to respond to this are, "Ma thought she heard ghosts in the static," or "Dad thought it was radioactive," or "I know how to set up a TV."
So you could just choose like, I don't want this nonsense. Bye.
Right? You can pretty much just reject it, reject the premise of the conversation. Or like the same character, you say something, she mentions somebody, and the main character says, "Your cousin?" And she says, "That's my father's brother's daughter, Shannon. We're about the same age. Well, we used to be. She's older now." Like, that's not how that. I like it.
Yeah, that character in particular that you're discussing, Weaver, is probably the most interesting character that you interact with in the first two parts, in my opinion. I think she knows more than she's letting on.
I love that too. Or I guess the third one that I can share out of my screenshots that doesn't feel like a spoiler. There's a few moments. There's a lot of moments in the game where you're driving around on the sort of world map of the game, and you can come across these sort of text interactions. I mentioned them earlier, but basically they're little like text prompts that come up as you pass something on the road, and you can choose to read them. And usually they're just very simple little 1 or 2 line scenarios. And there's one where you come across a man sitting by the side of the road playing a guitar, sitting on the ground. He's got a cup in front of him. And you have an option for whether you want to pass on by or put $1 in his cup. So I chose to put $1 in the young man's cup, and then the text says, "The young man stops playing, pulls the wet dollar bill out of his whiskey, and hands it back to you." I was just like, that's perfect.
Yeah, jerk.
You jerk. The game is full of moments of that kind of writing that feel. I'm sure they don't play as well when some idiot podcaster is reading them to you. They play perfectly in the game. It's really something. It's just really, really good writing.
Yeah, I think my biggest surprise of the game was probably in like the delivery system, that there is like a lot of opt-in type, like wandering around and finding stuff. Like I kind of thought this game would be completely on rails, and it wasn't. And it's little moments like that if you are feeling meandering, you can wander. And if you're not, you can choose to just go on with the plot, and you don't feel like you miss anything. And I think that was, I was surprised, because it seems like games that are praised for narrative are often just on rails, and you have to do all of the things to feel like you got the game. So that's probably, before we get into spoiler territory, that was the number one thing that surprised me in a good way about this game.
I also think before we get into spoiler territory, we could talk just about some of the themes of the game a little bit.
Yeah.
I took some notes about a few different themes that I saw, and I'd like to get your thoughts and maybe some of the ones that you guys think.
I'm curious, because I think I would have a really hard time picking out specific themes. It feels very like full of meaning, and yet I would have an incredibly difficult time telling you what anything means.
I'll tell you what theme's not there. Violence against women is not in this game.
Yay.
Yay.
Okay.
I had to say it again in telling lies, but like, again, sometimes games are praised for having like really great themes, and you kind of are like, cool, is someone gonna get murdered or worse? No. I know it seems like a weird thing to praise, but just if that's been keeping you from playing, it's not in the game. Don't worry about it.
Worth mentioning. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything significant that I'd have to say as like a content warning for this. There's maybe if you're claustrophobic, a lot of the game has to do with underground spaces. They're not presented in a particularly claustrophobic way, but I can't think of anything where I'd think of like a serious content warning about it.
Yeah, but Shane, go ahead. What were your themes before I was like, it's not about violence?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first theme was, I think, much more so than other adventure games, and more so than, I guess, a lot of narrative games, it plays with different perspectives. It very quickly drops you into kind of different characters and their in different interactions, and they're moving through the world as a group, and they have kind of different, a lot of times you're offered different choices for how you as the player respond to something, but instead of it being your different take on, sometimes it's different things Conway might say, right? And that is cool, where they give you kind of like your example with the TV setup, like different, what does Conway choose to share, right? But then there's also this additional character who I guess we'll talk about in spoiler territory, that gets introduced, who kind of joins the trip. And you're often kind of given moments where you are interacting as both kind of one or both of them, which I think that was kind of interesting. And it's not something that is super commonly done in games of this style.
Or and not to spoil anything, but or even you can sometimes be playing as observers of them in a really
Yeah.
weird sort of, it's a sort of a weird third person kind of narrative perspective.
Yeah, and that's kind of an extremely literary way of writing. Like, it feels kind of like, well, I don't know. It's that feels not very video gamey. I guess I'll just leave it at that because I want to talk about my other ideas too. The second thing I think is a big theme is just America's love affair with the automobile.
Mm.
We start off, the very first scene is in a very elaborately designed gas station.
Equus Oil.
Everything is about navigating around. One of the kind of key interactions that you have is you've got a kind of a notes section of your interface where you can see the turn-by-turn directions, like, go down the street until you get to the old abandoned prosthetics factory and then turn left, right? That's the kind of interaction you'll have with NPCs, and it'll have it also in your notes, and then you are having to follow that kind of directions, right? And so this is the classic image of like the kind of myth of the great American road trip, right? And also part of that like idea of the American road trip is driving along all of these oddly numbered highways like Kentucky Route Zero, and along the way having unique and bizarre sights to see, which, I mean, I think that's this game in a nutshell. So that's kind of another thing.
My husband and I just relocated from Chicago to New York, and we decided to road trip it. And we spent a lot of time in like rural Pennsylvania, and we kind of just added a couple extra days where I was like, hey, I'll take 3 hours off work in the morning so we can drive, and it's supposed to be a 1 hour drive, but let's stick around. And we ended up on like weird like
On an underground
cult-ish
freeway.
Yeah, we ended up on an underground freeway. Well, we found like a place where they have like a Krishna temple and a bunch of peacocks running around. And then we found like a beautiful overlook. And then we found a haunted prison. And like we just kept finding this random stuff. My Snapchat was really weird because everyone was like, I thought you were working today. What? Why did you send me an entire case of shivs as a Snapchat? But
You're
like
in Kentucky Route Zero.
But that's what this reminded me of. It's that kind of like, you have a lot of extra time, let's do it. And like, yeah, in this game, you don't necessarily have extra time, but you don't know where you're going, so you might as well stop.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
I don't normally road trip, so that's, I'm really glad I had that experience before I played this game.
Reagan, you have done a lot of road tripping in your life because you've moved cross country many times. And also I know that both you and your wife are elaborate trip planners. So I can imagine you have had some roadside attraction experiences.
Yes, but I don't think you understand just how methodical we are about our road trip planning. We drive fast and we don't take chances. We plan a route and we do it. And I don't think I've had the kind of road trip experience that this game really is sort of drawing on.
Well, that's because it's not real. Like, no one has truly had the kind of road trip experience that is like, because it's about this image or illusion of the great American road trip.
I mean, we used a website to find our beautiful things to stumble upon.
Like, imagining that this country is shot full of unique Americana, like somebody hit it with buckshot,
Yeah,
like,
it wasn't like you didn't need turn-by-turn directions to find the beautiful hidden mill.
Yeah, you can go into any bookstore and find a book called like Weird America that tells you where to find the weird things that are off the turnpike, but you're not going to be the only people there. Those things are, that's
you will be the only person there, but you're going to have Google show you the way, which I
Right.
think loses the magic.
I don't love the like, oh, it's a love affair to X, but like it's, or love letter to X, but it's definitely playing around with this sort of like idea of rural American travel that
It's a bunch of people from Chicago who took a road trip to Kentucky in a rented van for the weekend and were like, this is what all of it feels like.
This is what we wish we saw.
yeah.
Because that's where the developers are from. And they were like, this is what it was like, guys.
And specifically, when I use the phrase America's love affair with the automobile, I'm talking about something that is an abusive relationship.
Mm.
You know, America, crisscrossed itself with concrete in order to sell cars and in order to sell this idea of the open road that, can lead you into all these magical places.
Yeah.
But again, like I said, I think that's a myth. But it kind of leads me to the third theme that I think I have here, which is and I think maybe is the biggest theme in terms of the characters and the locations, which is just rural American poverty.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
There's the antique business that Conway works for seems like it's not necessarily doing great. I don't know. They're moving TVs around in the middle of the night.
We actually don't know what he's delivering yet. I don't know if we find that out at some point.
Okay,
later,
yeah, I don't think we know. Well, he did deliver a TV.
The TV was incidental. He needed to deliver the TV in order to get directions.
That's right.
But still, yeah.
Weaver's parents' farm
Yeah.
was repossessed. The TV repair shop had gone under. The that you go to, I'm talking about a bunch of this is getting into spoiler territory, but you really can't talk about true rural American poverty without talking about the exploitation of mine workers.
Yeah.
And I guess we'll talk about that. So I think overall, like that, almost every location really emphasizes that theme.
It's true.
And that's something
what do
we
you think?
praised a lot in Night in the Woods, and I don't think we realized how much this game deals in the same themes.
Yeah,
at that
and I
time.
don't think we realized at the time how much this game influenced Night in the Woods. I mean,
Oh yeah,
like,
yeah.
for sure. So yeah, that's very good stuff to call out, Shane, and I thank you for doing it, because I am like, I think I would have had a much harder time putting my finger on specific themes here, because I was pretty engrossed in the story and the dialogue and sort of like the weirdness of it, right? That I maybe wasn't taking enough time to stop and think about, like, what is this game trying to say with all of this stuff? It really doesn't feel like it's trying hard to get a specific message across, especially not like a specific like political or social message across. But it manages to do that through its tone and subject matter anyway. That's something you could maybe contrast this with something like Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods is a great game, and I don't want anybody to like skip it for any reason. It's one of my favorites, but like this feels more subtle than Night in the Woods.
Yeah, it's funny that a lot of the decade review stuff that talked about Kentucky Route Zero talked about it kind of as the different chapters unfolded, picking up different parts of the theme of rural poverty, like over time, like as what was like going on, the 2 years of development kind of sunk into it. And so some people called it like a game of the decade because it covers the themes of the decade, because if it's something is development slowly, like it can kind of roll up a lot of this stuff, and it's interesting to see it all at once at the end.
Yeah, and if it's not clear, we are recording this having played just the first two acts, and that was sort of intentional. We knew we were really only going to want to talk about. We needed a manageable chunk of the game to talk about, and it seemed like a good approach, right? To go ahead and play just the first two acts, which came out to close enough together in 2013, and the rest of the game is came out between now and a week from today, basically. That part we're kind of leaving for maybe another episode or something. So there's definitely going to be, maybe if you've played more of this game than we have, you're looking at what we're talking about here and saying, oh, they haven't even picked up on the important themes that come up in acts 3 and 4 and maybe 5. And you're right. But it's still really interesting to look at just like what what was their, this feels like with it, looking at just the first two acts, you're kind of seeing like what was their original intent with this game, and the idea that this might have grown and changed in what it was trying to say over the course of a decade only makes it more interesting.
So I don't think this game can be spoiled, but I think we're going to talk a little bit about story beats now, or things we found really
Spoiled.
interesting.
I don't think this game can be explained.
Yeah. So, like, if you're really nervous and want to go in completely pristine, turn off now. But
yeah, much in the way that like reading a plot summary of like almost anything that has surreal elements to it feels like completely like it's missing the true story.
It's like reading a plot synopsis of the first 3 episodes of Twin Peaks. Like,
Yeah.
did you actually see Twin Peaks? No.
No, you don't know anything about what happened, because what happens is how it makes you feel while you're playing through it, and like what it evokes, and all sorts of other things that just don't get drawn up in a plot summary. So even if you went and read the plot summary of this, there's nothing about that would necessarily like spoil anything for you. That said, we are gonna probably, I mean, I'm not going to do a full-on spoiler break. You won't hear the drum beats here, but we're going to be talking about the first 2 acts and like some moments from them that stood out to us.
I'll just do the drum beats anyway. Boom, boom, chugga boom, ba-doom, cha.
Thank you, Shane. I appreciate that. Less editing for me. So the first act, we're introduced to Conway and his dog. Is the dog always named Blue? I forget if that was a choice or not.
You choose it.
Choose the dogs.
I named the dog because his name is Homer, and I was like, it's an Odyssey reference. And then I named the dog Blue because I wanted it to be a lady.
Right? Yeah, that was my preference as well. And the dog is wearing a straw hat, which I love. The dog is like a constant presence in the game, and one of the things I really like about the dog is that you can always go over and talk to the dog, and you're given some choices about like how you address the dog that give you some idea about like what Conway thinks about the dog. So you always have a sort of a choice between addressing the dog as sort of like an elderly, long-suffering companion that, you know, sorry you had to walk all this way, boy, or a kind of a, I don't have a good example of the way this sort of thing is phrased, but there's also always a choice to sort of regard the dog as like an elder, wizened old, someone to be respected, someone who's taking it all in and observing the world around them in a way that, there's sort of different ways to perceive that dog. And every chance I got, I was like, this dog is worthy of respect. It's a good video game dog.
Just every time you tell the dog, like, stay and guard the truck, boy, and you walk off and it like slowly follows you.
That poor skeletal dog.
It walks much slower than you do, and yet somehow it never really gets left behind. I liked that about it. And of course, you meet up with the guy who runs Equus Oil. Equus Oil, I mean, it's the first scene of the game, but it's also one of the most striking images, and it's obviously what they use on a lot of the marketing materials and things. If you download this game from one of the various stores, it'll probably be the like headline image. And it's this really cool Art Deco looking, filling station, but with this massive horse head sculpture, sort of poking out of the top or maybe just behind it.
It has this sort of Googie style slanted roof that is like, I mean, all in all, that whole thing, it looks like something you'd find in the middle of like the Nevada desert, in my opinion. Like it's a gorgeous structure, and my favorite thing about it is the depth to it. Like as you explore the space, the whole thing is revealed to not just be a horse's head, to be an enormous horse that is partially submerged in the earth.
Just so good.
When you get into the basement underneath it, like that is also shaped like a horse, and you never see the whole thing at once. But it's I don't know, that really is it's just a gorgeous location.
That was,
and
cool.
we're introduced to that location also with the truck, which is the kind of unspoken companion through this whole thing. Is this truck that's a true antique. It looks like maybe a 1920s or 30s box truck with little round And you almost never see detail in the truck. It's like it's a blank figure, just a shape of a solid color,
glowing
except for these
headlights and a
two
square
glowing
of
headlights.
dark. Yeah. I really, really liked the moment. So obviously, you meet the guy who runs the filling station, and he tells you you'll need to get on the zero. But there was a moment in there that I thought was really cool, and I kind of wondered what they were trying to say with it. I have my little theories about it, but like you go down into the basement, and you need to turn on a power switch, and there's a bunch of people sitting around sort of a card table playing a game that, if you listen through to their dialogue, is kind of like it sounds almost as if they're playing a tabletop version of Kentucky Route Zero. They've got like maps of Kentucky spread out on a table, and they're talking about things like probability tables and dice rolls and things like that. And they've lost their D20, and you have to go and find it for them. But of course, when you go back, they're gone. And the sort of disappearance of these gamers who are playing a sort of a odd abstracted version of the game that you yourself are playing. I had a feeling that this was sort of the developer trying to take a moment and say, like, leave your gamer behind. You're not. This is you sort of trying to tell you, like, no, you're in the surreal Kentucky now. These folks here were trying to figure out game systems and dice rolls and so on these on the Kentucky Route Zero map, right? But the game is sort of vanishes them immediately, and I felt in a way kind of like the game was telling me, like, you can drop all of that. This isn't that type of game.
Oh, I
Did
just
you
was
keep
like,
the die, or did you leave it on the table?
Oh, I definitely pocketed it.
I kept it.
Oh, I left it on the table.
Who knows when you might need a D20, right?
I was like, are the D&D ghosts gonna come back, and like, will they be like, are they gonna be stuck forever? I was like, did I free them by finding this die, or am I? And then I kept it, and then I walked out, and I was like, oh, I should have put the die back, but I don't want to go back.
Their souls are trapped forever in the die. It's your fault.
Yeah, I told him I would try and find it, so I left it for them on the table.
That seems
You're
appropriate.
a better person than we are.
I thought maybe they'll turn up again, and I'll give it to them then.
Although, honestly, if I actually in real life could have a glow in the dark D20, that'd be tight.
All right, I'll add that to my Christmas gift list. And yeah, so obviously we're not going to talk through every beat, but I did want to talk a little bit about Weaver. Shane, you mentioned her earlier. Weaver is the character that you meet. You're directed to go to talk to her because she knows the way to the zero, and you're trying to make a delivery on Dogwood Drive, and you need to take the zero to get there, or so you're told. So she knows the way to the zero. We go to try to find Weaver, and she is real weird. What was your guys' read on Weaver?
She's dead?
I kind of thought she was a ghost too, but
then she's not.
that's the only. I mean, like, you can't like, ferret out like a true meaning behind any of this stuff. But the idea of like that they were the same age once, but her cousin is older now, definitely had a kind of a ghostly ring to it to me.
But it also could be like, my cousin has her shit together and I don't.
Of course,
so,
of course.
Like, all of this stuff, like, that's what I liked about Weaver, is that all of her language has this plausible deniability.
Absolutely.
Of, like, she might just be kind of like, I've been watching some Fringe recently, and I'm like, she might just be kind of like people on Fringe who say things and they take the poetic way around things.
Yeah, my take on Weaver was not, I definitely did not even begin to think like, oh, she's a ghost or something like that. I more thought of her as like someone who was kind of, maybe in touch with another plane, or like, actually there's a sense that I got from her especially, but really from everyone in this game, that they are halfway here and halfway somewhere else. Yeah. And for Weaver, the thing that stood out for me about her is that every time she spoke, she had something to say, some statement to make, but she always turned it back on you with a question. Every single line she had turns things back to you with a question that seemed designed to feel insightful, but also in a way like oracular somehow. Mm-hmm. Like that was kind of the vibe that I got from her.
She definitely sort of felt like she had one foot in and one foot out, because she she was returning to a family home that she had left at some point, and also then she vanishes again. And when you speak to her cousin Shannon, who's become sort of the second main character, uh, uh, she expresses like surprise, like you talked to Weaver, like how, and you can interpret that. I thought at the time like, oh, maybe she didn't know she was back in town, but it could also just be like, well, she didn't know she was back from wherever they go, right? Like it's anyway, I thought she was a really neat. I hope she shows back up. She hasn't showed back up again since that initial encounter with her, but I have a strong feeling that she will. I don't know whether it'll happen in Acts 3 or 4 or maybe 5, but I feel like there's an important thread there for Shannon. And speaking of Shannon, we meet her at the Elkhorn mine. The Elkhorn,
Oh,
yeah.
before we go to the bait shop, and did you guys stick your hands in the tank?
Oh my God, yes, that's super weird. I mean,
Did you get electrocuted?
Stick your hand in what tank?
So if you go to the bait shop, there's a bunch of tanks there, and you can stick your hand in there. And if you stick your hand all the way down to the bottom, like you think something's gonna happen, and then you pass out, like you have this flashback, and then like you come to, and the guy's like, and he points, and like the sign that was hanging above it like fell into the tank and slightly electrocuted you. So like you think you had this beautiful moment, and he's like, no, dude, you just got like electrocuted.
I love that. It felt not so much like a beautiful moment or a flashback as like suddenly you were transported to a moment of drudgery, and it was a moment where you were working. I'm not even sure if it was your life or Conway's life, rather, but like it was a moment where you're working on a roof, and you're day drinking, probably irresponsibly, and then driving, and it's like it did not seem like a beautiful moment to me. It in fact seemed kind of like a moment of
guilt or something.
Yeah, guilt, or maybe just sort of like again, Shane, to the theme of like rural American poverty. It just sort of felt like a very sort of everyday, not good interaction with, I don't know, the world. It was bad.
Yeah, and I don't remember it very well. I just remember that like you had this flashback.
Yeah, it's weird.
So it's probably not a.
It's a weird. Oh, I don't know. You could definitely read it that way though, because it does have that sort of like peacefulness, but also like a peacefulness of like, this is still shit. It was a weird thing to sort of suddenly flash to, and then you're right, like it did sort of turn it into a joke with the like, you got electrocuted.
Yeah, and the fact that I didn't see that, I wonder how dense these maps are with those sort of incidental locations, because I thought I really checked out everywhere on that first big map, and clearly I didn't.
I think it's super cool that you can wander around and find this stuff or not, and it's easy to miss. And I don't know, it feels more like driving around at night, like you might miss something.
That's true, yeah. And sometimes, you drive past something, a little dot shows up on the map, you double back, and hopefully it's still there. It's has that sort of like it does sort of feel like night driving. It's I don't know if we said it at the top, but the when they describe the length of the game, the developers say it's roughly the length of a summer night, and it really does sort of have this sort of like long summer night. It's too dark. It has this really like, has a real vibe to it with that sort of thing. So I mean, obviously, I don't think we need to go through every plot point, but I do want to make sure we at least hit the major characters. And Shannon is the sort of second lead that we meet when we get to the Elkhorn mine. We've been told that is where we can find the entrance to the Zero, but when we get there, it seems like that maybe isn't the case, but Shannon thinks she knows how to find it. And I don't know, what's your read on Shannon? What's her deal?
I don't know why she was in the mine initially. You find her on the phone with someone, once again hitting on this theme of like rural American poverty. She's talking about maybe it sounds like she's fleeing a unpleasant relationship, maybe abusive, and then wants someone out of her house but is trying to split the rent. I got that. I think that's what I picked up from that first conversation. But she's also clearly like milling around this old mine that she has a very personal connection to. I guess I'll let somebody else explain that connection.
Yes. If you go to the bait shop, there is a sign on the door that says she thinks she's going to meet Waverly at the mine.
Yeah. So she was going there to meet her cousin that we saw earlier. But
That's
So,
right.
like, Waverly showed up at the bait shop apparently and told her to meet that she'd meet her at the mine, and then she didn't show up, but or told her to go to
Why
the
anyone would
mine.
want to meet anyone there is yet again a mystery of this game.
yeah, but
Yeah.
there is a sort of family history to it too. So we mentioned earlier that there's sort of a tragedy to the mine. You get a lot of details from Shannon about the miners who once worked in this mine, the sort of abusive practices of the mining company. That they got paid in plastic coal chits or something like that, coal scrip. And that they would have to spend coal scrip in order to do things like run basic equipment like fans to keep the air circulating in the mine. And you also learn about some researchers or sort of musicologists, what's the word for that? The maybe,
Ethnomusicologists?
yeah, that were.
I don't.
I think I don't know. There's a word used for it in the game, and I don't remember exactly what it was. But anyway, sort of researchers, sort of trying to collect
Yeah, I
folk
think they just
music.
call them archivists.
That's sounds about right. Anyway, we get
I
a
don't know if I saw this part. So
Oh, well, we get
I'm
some
just.
history about these researchers going down into the mine to sort of collect songs from the miners, paying them in coal scrip, and getting songs from them. And I believe that there was a cave in the mine, and I think all of them died. And it's revealed later that the researchers, the archivists, whatever, were Weaver's family, like parents or something. Um, I don't know. It's a little vague, like a lot of the things in this game are, but it has this sort of feeling of history, a sort of in that same way that maybe another theme of this game is this sort of like tie to the history of the place, a history that goes back a long ways, including things like people have been abused by the powerful forever, right?
One of my favorite details in this mine is that the different branches of it are marked with kind of random objects kind of hung from the walls. And she kind of states that, like, for example, one of them is like marked with a rowboat hung from the wall. And she mentions that the miners, in order to not get lost, would use their company store credit to buy things like this rowboat and hang them in the mine as ways to mark the different paths and locations. And they especially kind of really drill home this idea of the company store by having the tokens that the miners would earn. They would actually have to spend those in a machine to turn on things like the lights and the ventilation.
And things like the little mine cart that you have to ride around on. Yeah, it's a pretty cool scene, and obviously like they wanted to play with these ideas of like caves and underground things. The Zero itself is an underground highway connected to this mine, and obviously like if they were playing on the Colossal Cave adventure, like they definitely had caves and mines on the mind. Um, it was a moment in the game that felt a little bit slower than a lot of the other
Mhm.
parts. There's a bit more sort of exploring in here, and I at times I felt like it was maybe a little bit too slow.
Yeah, this is one of two. What I would, and this is one of my least favorite things in the game is there's a couple of these pointless mazes that are not challenging.
Yeah, there's like four directions you can go in. I went in all three of the wrong ones first, naturally.
Of course.
And the second one I'm referring to is there's an elevator sequence later on. You'll know,
Yeah.
but I think there's a couple of places like this in the game where they want to add maybe um, maybe a 2 or 3 interesting locations and interactions for you to have, but they put it into a large multi-path structure that has some interest, but also just adds a lot of backtracking and navigation time.
Yeah,
and I
Conway
wasn't a
walks
fan.
really slowly. You know, the characters all
We
walk
have not
very
mentioned,
slowly.
one of the first things that happens to him in the mine is there's a cave in and it injures his leg, and so he becomes even slower and limps for the rest of the game.
Yeah, so it's definitely it's not without its adventure game pitfalls, right? You know, I've definitely had this issue in other adventure games. It's a bit of just a sort of a feature of the genre. You kind of have to know that you're going to be dealing with walking around at a pace that feels a little too slow. Maybe the camera pans a little slower than you'd like. Maybe there's a place where you try to click where you want to walk to where that's not a place you can actually walk to, that kind of thing. And that's just sort of part of games designed like this. I got past it, not a big deal. But I will say it was definitely, it's still a thing because I think it's a thing in all games that are built this way. I wonder if there's any important moments that you guys remember from maybe the second act that you particularly want to call out as really great moments or maybe really great settings.
I'll say I really liked the bears, and
that is a really, really good bit. Explain it just a little bit.
So one of the floors on the elevator in the bureau in the what is the full name of
Bureau
the
of
building?
Reclaimed Spaces.
Yes, the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces. One of the floors in the elevator is just marked bears.
Yeah.
And of course, I went there first, and you just get out, and the bears are just like there. And it's just bears.
They just look at you.
Didn't know what you were expecting.
Yeah, you get in the elevator and you get the choices. 5th floor, diagrams and drafts. 4th floor, archives and records. 3rd floor, bears. 2nd floor, conference room. 1st floor, clerk's offices, lobby. I also immediately, I immediately hit to go all the way to the diagrams and drafts floor, which is where I was actually headed, and zoomed past, and there were the bears. I was like, damn, why didn't I go to the bears? So, of course, I got back in the elevator and went back and saw the bears. They're just there. They're just hanging out.
I also really liked the concept of a museum of dwellings, like a house museum, and
I love that too. Do you remember there was
cool concept.
you know what it reminded me of very strongly was that there was a park in Houston when I was a kid where they had transported a number of houses from all over the state to this park. And I don't even remember what the park was called, and I'm not sure if it's still there or not, but like you could go to this park and they had a sort of log,
It's still there.
a historical log cabin and a couple of other older houses, and they made a big deal in the little signs that you could read about how these had been picked up and moved there. Whereas the Museum of Dwellings, like they literally like bulldozed the town, but they brought the dwellings from the town, many different dwellings, like, fancy houses, but also things like a tent and RVs, and even things like chicken coops, and brought them all together into this Museum of Dwellings, but people still live in most of them.
Since we've moved on to discussing the second chapter, I would like to bring up there's something that I always watch for in video games, and I think it's an indicator of creativity in video games, and it's the what I would consider the time to crystal indicator. Because in most video games, is particularly prevalent in role-playing games. At a certain point, they will introduce an ominous and powerful crystal.
Invariably. Sometimes it's an orb, but sometimes it's a crystal orb, so that counts too.
Sometimes it is a crystal orb, yeah. Usually it is a naturally formed looking shard of crystal. Sometimes the crystal is separated into different shards, and you have to collect all of them. This is the only game that I've ever... So the time to crystal in Kentucky Route Zero is 1 act and 1 scene, which is, I would say, better than some games, percentage-wise. But it did have a unique use of this crystal. I found it very, very amusing. Once you're on the Kentucky Route Zero, many of the pieces of direction that you are given involve this large, ominously hovering crystal. So you might receive directions that say something like, go to the crystal, go clockwise until you reach the crystal, then turn around.
Yeah, we didn't talk about
And go
the
back.
map screens that much, and that's something where like it gets way weirder in Act 2. Like on the first, in the first, or rather in Act 2. In the first act, you're on a map that resembles a real map of Kentucky, around the Mammoth Cave Park, right? But in Act 2, when you finally make it to the zero is a circular highway. So if you continue around in a circle, you'll see some of the same landmarks again and again, or you might see slightly different ones. Like if you get to the crystal in reverse, and you'll find something different than was there before, that kind of thing. I thought that was really cool, and it looks cool. Like it's a really cool looking map. It's like this wild sort of like white on black wireframe illustration thing. I thought it looked really neat. And I also really love that you do return to the main map of Kentucky at the end of the chapter, but you do it with flight. Like at the end of the chapter, you've met a little boy who has a brother who's a giant eagle, and offers to fly you to the forest where the doctor lives so that you can get Conway's leg looked at. And
Do you remember the Joy Division album Unknown Pleasures?
I can't say that I remember specifics about it. What do you mean?
So it was the one, I'm thinking specifically of the album cover for Unknown Pleasures, which had this kind of white on black waveform illustration.
Oh, that sounds familiar. Yes. Okay. I've seen it more as t-shirts than an album cover, honestly.
Yeah, it shows up on t-shirts a lot because it's a really striking design, and I think it's really similar to the design of the Zero, and the album cover for Unknown Pleasures is actually like a scientific illustration of the signal emitted by a pulsar, which
Rad.
that is really what it reminded me of.
That's good shit. I love that. I don't know what else I need to say about this game, other about the story of this game, other than that, like, it definitely has me hooked, and I'm extremely excited to play more of it. I was relieved that the way this game is structured, it's designed to let you jump into any chapter. You're not carrying a lot of saved state from one chapter into another. So when you play this game, you get a menu you can choose from, and you can choose to play any chapter in any order. Right from the start, you don't have to unlock them, which I think is going to be very useful for folks who might be returning to this after a long time away. If you last played Kentucky Route Zero back in 2013, you probably don't have a save file from then. But you don't need one. You can download it on the Nintendo Switch when that version comes out and decide to start at any point that you want. Or maybe you want to play a couple minutes of Chapter 1 to refresh your memory about what all that was about, and then jump straight to Chapter 3 or Chapter 4 or something like that. The game definitely allows you to do that, and I very much appreciate that about it. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to playing more of this, and especially to playing through Act 5 and seeing the conclusion of something that has been so long in the making. So I'm eager to hear what everybody's thoughts are about Act 5 when it comes out. I don't know what could possibly hold up to this. Like, I don't know how any developer can satisfy after this long of a development process for the final act of anything. But
Any predictions?
well, I haven't played Acts 3 or 4 yet, so I hardly feel qualified to predict.
Some good bluegrass tunes.
Yep.
That's my prediction.
Yep. It's a good prediction.
I think they're going to go full 3D FPS, add a few guns.
I think that Act 5 is going to be VR exclusive.
It was a joke I was going to make.
Yeah, we're all going to have to upgrade our Nintendo Switches with the head mount.
Laura, get your Kinect out of the closet.
I do not own one. I'll fly to Seattle and use Derek's.
Shout outs to Derek.
Shout out to Derek, who does not listen to this podcast.
I'm very eager to hear our listeners' thoughts about this game too. So, listeners, if you have anything to say about maybe you've played bits of Kentucky Route Zero over the years, or maybe you have thoughts about the TV edition and Act 5 coming out, let us know. We're on Twitter @_shortgame.
Maybe you have a different favorite monospaced font.
Yeah, maybe you want to tell us what you use in your terminal windows. Let us know about that.
Maybe you're experiencing rural American poverty. I would hope not. I hope all our listeners are thriving and prospering.
Yes. Tell us all about all of that stuff. In fact, probably the best way to chat with us about this stuff would be on our Discord. If you're one of our patrons, so patreon.com/theshortgame, supporters at any level get access to our exclusive patrons-only Discord, which is where the conversations on this show begin, and it's where we plan shows, it's where we talk about the games that we are playing that don't make it on the show, and it's where we post GIFs and other memes. So join us there. And you can also, of course, find our website, www.theshortgame.net, where there's a contact form, and we invite you to give us suggestions of games to cover there. That's a great way to get in touch with us too. And of course, leave us a review. We have not been mentioning that lately, but it does make a big difference if you like the show. We would love for you to leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice, if it allows for such things. I'm Reagan Kelly, and you can find me on Twitter @ReaganK. That's RayGank. Laura, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter @LauraJNash.
And Shane, where can people find you?
You can find me endlessly roaming America's back roads, and on Twitter @8bitshane.
And listeners, thank you for listening to The Short Game.